At the dawn of the 17th century, the Atlantic Ocean represented far more than a geographical boundary between continents. It stood as an immense barrier of uncertainty, danger, and possibility that would fundamentally reshape the trajectory of human history. Across the waters of this vast expanse, European powers gazed westward with ambitions that combined commercial interests, religious fervor, and political competition in measures that varied according to circumstance and opportunity. The Spanish had already established their dominance in Central and South America, extracting wealth that transformed their nation into a formidable empire. Meanwhile, the French were gradually extending their influence through the northern territories, building trading networks based primarily on fur commerce with indigenous populations. However, along the eastern seaboard of what would eventually become the United States, another narrative was beginning to unfold, one that would prove uniquely consequential in shaping the modern world. The story of the 13 British colonies that emerged along this coastline cannot be properly understood without first examining the conditions that prevailed in England during the late 16th and early 17th centuries. The nation was experiencing profound transformations across multiple dimensions of society simultaneously. Religious conflicts had intensified following the English Reformation, creating deep divisions that permeated every aspect of civic life. King Henry VIII's break with the Roman Catholic Church in the 1530s had set in motion a series of religious upheavals that continued to reverberate through subsequent generations. Under Queen Elizabeth I, who reigned from 1558 to 1603, England officially adopted Protestantism. Yet this resolution satisfied neither the Catholics who wished to return to Rome, nor the more radical Protestants who believed the Church of England had not gone far enough in purifying itself of Catholic practices and doctrines. These religious tensions intersected with significant economic pressures that were reshaping English society in fundamental ways. The practice of enclosure, whereby common lands were converted into private pastures for sheep farming, had displaced thousands of rural families from their traditional livelihoods. The wool trade proved immensely profitable for landowners, but it created a growing class of landless laborers who migrated to cities in search of work that often proved scarce and inadequate. London, in particular, swelled with impoverished populations living in conditions of considerable hardship. Simultaneously, population growth throughout the 16th century had created additional strains on available resources, contributing to social instability and economic competition that left many without prospects for meaningful advancement within the existing social structure. Political considerations also played a crucial role in directing English attention toward the possibilities of American colonization. Spain's growing power, funded substantially by the gold and silver extracted from its American territories, posed a strategic threat to English interests. Queen Elizabeth had supported privateering expeditions against Spanish shipping, with figures such as Sir Francis Drake achieving both fame and fortune through sanctioned piracy that weakened Spanish dominance while enriching English coffers. However, these raids represented merely tactical responses to Spanish power rather than a comprehensive strategy for building English influence in the New World. The establishment of permanent colonies would require different approaches, greater resources, and sustained commitment over extended periods. The first serious English attempt at American colonization came in 1585, when Sir Walter Raleigh sponsored an expedition to Roanoke Island, located off the coast of present-day North Carolina. This venture, however, ended in mysterious failure when the colonists vanished without trace, leaving behind only the cryptic word Croatoan carved into a post. The fate of these settlers has never been conclusively determined, though theories range from integration with local Native American tribes to death from disease or conflict. This early disaster demonstrated the enormous challenges inherent in establishing viable settlements across the Atlantic, yet it did not extinguish English ambitions. Rather, it provided sobering lessons about the necessity of adequate preparation, sustained supply lines, and realistic understanding of the conditions that colonists would face in unfamiliar territories. The true beginning of permanent English colonization came in 1607 with the establishment of Jamestown in Virginia. This venture was organized not by the Crown itself, but by the Virginia Company of London, a joint stock company that brought together investors willing to risk capital in hopes of substantial returns. The business model reflected the emerging capitalist structures that were beginning to transform European economic life. Shareholders expected that the colony would discover gold, find a passage to Asia, or generate other forms of wealth that would justify their investment. The reality they encountered proved far more challenging than these optimistic projections anticipated. The initial settlers who arrived at Jamestown in May 1607 were predominantly gentlemen unaccustomed to physical labor, along with a smaller number of craftsmen and laborers. Their choice of settlement location reflected strategic concerns about defense against potential Spanish attacks, leading them to select a marshy peninsula along the James River. This site offered certain advantages for protection, but proved disastrously unhealthy, with brackish water, mosquito-borne diseases, and inadequate food sources combining to create conditions of severe hardship. Within months, illness and starvation had claimed the lives of many colonists. The winter of 1609 to 1610, known subsequently as the Starving Time, reduced the population from approximately 500 to a mere 60 survivors who endured by consuming whatever they could find, with accounts suggesting that desperation drove some to cannibalism. The colony's survival hinged on several critical developments that unfolded during these desperate years. Captain John Smith, though a controversial figure whose accounts often emphasized his own heroic role, provided essential leadership by imposing discipline and organizing efforts to secure food through trade with local Native American populations. His famous proclamation that "He who does not work shall not eat" represented a practical necessity that helped mobilize colonists toward productive activity rather than fruitless searches for gold. The relationship between the colonists and the Powhatan Confederacy, a powerful alliance of indigenous tribes led by Chief Wahunsenacau, proved complex and volatile. Initial exchanges sometimes provided the colonists with corn and other provisions essential for survival. Yet tensions frequently erupted into violence as the settlers' presence threatened indigenous lands and resources. Another crucial factor in Jamestown's eventual stabilization came with the introduction of tobacco cultivation. John Rolfe, who arrived in 1610 and later married Pocahontas, the daughter of Chief Wahunsenacau, experimented with tobacco strains that proved suitable for English tastes. By 1612, he had developed methods for cultivating a mild variety that created immediate demand in England, where tobacco consumption was rapidly becoming fashionable, despite King James I's personal distaste for the habit. This crop transformed Virginia's economic prospects entirely, providing the profitable commodity that investors had sought. However, tobacco cultivation proved labor-intensive and quickly exhausted soil nutrients, driving continuous expansion onto new lands and creating persistent conflicts with Native American populations whose territories were progressively encroached upon. The demand for labor to work the tobacco fields led to the development of the indentured servitude system, whereby individuals agreed to work for a specified period, typically 4 to 7 years, in exchange for passage to America, food, shelter, and sometimes a small plot of land upon completion of their service. Many poor English citizens accepted these terms, viewing temporary bondage as a pathway to eventual opportunity in a land where labor shortages meant that even former servants might acquire property and establish independent livelihoods. This system would dominate Virginia's labor force for decades before the gradual shift toward African slavery that began with the arrival of the first enslaved Africans in 1619 brought by a Dutch ship to Point Comfort. Initially, their legal status remained ambiguous, with some eventually gaining freedom, but over subsequent decades, colonial laws increasingly codified racial slavery as a permanent hereditary condition that would profoundly shape American society. While Virginia developed as a commercial venture focused on tobacco cultivation, the second major center of English colonization emerged from entirely different motivations. In September 1620, the ship Mayflower departed from Plymouth, England, carrying 102 passengers who would establish Plymouth Colony in present-day Massachusetts. These settlers, known as Pilgrims, represented a radical Protestant group called Separatists, who had concluded that the Church of England was irredeemably corrupt, and that true Christians must separate entirely from its structures. Their religious convictions had previously driven them into exile in the Netherlands, where they lived for more than a decade in the city of Leiden. However, concerns about their children assimilating into Dutch culture and losing their English identity, combined with economic difficulties and fears of war, led them to seek a new home where they might establish a community governed by their religious principles. The Mayflower's voyage proved arduous, taking 66 days to cross the Atlantic through autumn storms that tested the ship's structure and the passengers' endurance. They arrived off the coast of Cape Cod in November 1620, significantly north of their intended destination in Virginia Territory. Before disembarking, the adult male passengers signed the Mayflower Compact, an agreement establishing basic governmental structures and committing themselves to create just and equal laws for the colony's general good. This document, though brief and practical in nature, represented an important moment in the development of self-governance principles, as the signers recognized that their settlement outside the jurisdiction of any existing government required them to establish legitimate authority through mutual consent. The Pilgrims' first winter in Plymouth proved devastatingly harsh, with inadequate shelter, insufficient food, and a disease claiming approximately half the colonists' lives by spring. Their survival depended substantially on assistance from local Wampanoag people, particularly an individual named Tisquantum, known to the colonists as Squanto, who taught them agricultural techniques appropriate to the region, including the practice of planting corn with fish as fertilizer. Squanto's ability to speak English resulted from a tragic personal history involving kidnapping by English explorers years earlier, experience that now proved invaluable in facilitating communication between the colonists and the Wampanoag sachem Massasoit. In autumn 1621, the colonists celebrated their first successful harvest with a feast that included Wampanoag guests, an event later mythologized as the first Thanksgiving, though its significance and character differed considerably from subsequent commemorative narratives. The establishment of Plymouth Colony was followed in 1630 by a much larger migration known as the Great Migration, which brought approximately 20,000 English Puritans to New England over the subsequent decade. Unlike the separatist Pilgrims, these Puritans had not abandoned the Church of England entirely, but sought to purify it from within. However, increasing persecution under Archbishop William Laud, combined with economic difficulties and political tensions during the reign of King Charles I, convinced many that England was becoming inhospitable to godly living. Under the leadership of John Winthrop, the Massachusetts Bay Company established Boston and surrounding settlements with the explicit goal of creating what Winthrop described as a city upon a hill, a model Christian community that would demonstrate proper religious and social order to the watching world. Massachusetts Bay Colony quickly developed distinctive characteristics that reflected Puritan theological convictions and social values. Church membership became closely tied to political participation, with only male church members eligible to vote in colony affairs. Ministers held tremendous influence, though they were formally barred from holding political office in recognition of the importance of maintaining distinctions between civil and ecclesiastical authority. The Puritans emphasized education, believing that individuals must be able to read Scripture for themselves, leading to the establishment of schools and eventually Harvard College in 1636, created initially to train ministers but gradually expanding its educational mission. Towns were organized around meeting houses that served both religious and civic functions, with land distributed according to principles that balanced private property with communal responsibility. Despite their own experience of religious persecution, or perhaps because of their conviction that they possessed the singular truth, Massachusetts Puritans proved intolerant of religious dissent within their midst. This intolerance generated several significant conflicts and departures that led to the founding of additional colonies. Roger Williams, a minister who arrived in 1631, quickly aroused controversy by arguing that civil authorities had no legitimate power over religious matters, and that the colonists had no right to land that they had not purchased from Native Americans. His views threatened the colony's fundamental assumptions about the integration of civil and religious authority. In 1635, colonial leaders banished Williams, prompting him to flee south where, with the assistance of Narragansett people, he established Providence in 1636, founding what would become Rhode Island. Williams's settlement was notable for its principles of religious tolerance and separation of church and state, offering refuge to religious dissenters including Baptists, Quakers, and Jews who faced persecution elsewhere. Another dissenter, Anne Hutchinson, challenged Massachusetts' orthodoxy through religious gatherings in her home, where she discussed sermons and advanced theological interpretations that emphasized personal spiritual experience and divine grace over adherence to moral law. Her teachings attracted substantial followings, but alarmed ministers and magistrates who saw in them dangerous antinomian tendencies that threatened to undermine religious and social order. In 1637, she was tried for heresy and sedition, with her gender adding another layer of controversy as male authorities deemed it inappropriate for a woman to teach theological matters. Following her banishment, Hutchinson and her followers initially joined Williams in Rhode Island before establishing their own settlement. These conflicts, while representing failures of tolerance, paradoxically contributed to expanding the geography of English settlement and establishing precedents for religious diversity that would eventually influence broader American traditions. The colonization of Connecticut followed similar patterns of expansion from Massachusetts, though with less dramatic conflicts. In the mid-1630s, groups of settlers moved into the Connecticut River Valley, attracted by reports of fertile land and motivated by both economic opportunity and disputes with Massachusetts authorities. Thomas Hooker led one group from Cambridge to establish Hartford in 1636. These Connecticut settlements soon adopted the Fundamental Orders in 1639, a governing document that established representative government with elected officials, and has sometimes been characterized as an early constitution, though this interpretation remains debated among historians. Connecticut maintained Puritan religious culture similar to Massachusetts, but with somewhat more flexible standards and greater emphasis on land availability for agricultural development. While New England colonies developed their distinctive religious cultures and town-based societies, the Mid-Atlantic region saw different patterns emerge. The Dutch had established New Netherland in the 1620s, centered on New Amsterdam at the southern tip of Manhattan Island, focusing primarily on fur trade rather than extensive agricultural settlement. However, English ambitions in this strategically important region led to conflict. In 1664, during a period of Anglo-Dutch rivalry, King Charles II granted his brother James, Duke of York, proprietary rights to lands that included New Netherland. An English naval expedition arrived to claim the territory, and the Dutch governor Peter Stuyvesant, facing overwhelming force and lacking support from his own colonists who had grievances about his autocratic rule, surrendered without significant resistance. New Amsterdam became New York, and the entire colony passed into English control, bringing with it an ethnically and religiously diverse population that included Dutch, English, French, Scandinavian, African, and Jewish residents. James granted the southern portion of his new domain to two proprietors, Lord John Berkeley and Sir George Carteret, who established New Jersey as a proprietary colony intended to attract settlers through relatively generous land policies and religious tolerance. The colony's development proved complicated by competing claims, changes in ownership, and eventual division into East Jersey and West Jersey before reunification under royal authority in 1702. Nevertheless, New Jersey attracted diverse populations, including Quakers, Presbyterians, and Dutch Reformed communities who established farming settlements that took advantage of the region's fertile soil and access to both the Hudson and Delaware rivers. Pennsylvania emerged from the vision of William Penn, a prominent Quaker who received proprietary rights to a vast territory in 1681 as settlement of a debt the Crown owed his deceased father. Penn conceived of Pennsylvania as a holy experiment, where Quaker principles of pacifism, religious tolerance, and social equality could be implemented. The Society of Friends, commonly known as Quakers, faced severe persecution in England for their beliefs in the inner light available to all individuals, their refusal to observe hierarchical social customs, their opposition to taking oaths, and their pacifist rejection of military service. Penn's colony offered them refuge while also welcoming settlers of other faiths through policies of religious liberty that proved remarkably advanced for the era. Philadelphia, established in 1682 with a carefully planned grid layout, rapidly grew into a prosperous commercial center that attracted diverse populations including English, Welsh, German, and Scots-Irish immigrants. Penn's relatively enlightened approach extended to relations with Native Americans, as he insisted on purchasing land through treaties and maintaining peaceful relations with the Lenape and other indigenous peoples. This policy contributed to decades of relative peace between colonists and native populations in Pennsylvania, contrasting with the violent conflicts that characterized many other colonial frontiers. However, as Pennsylvania's population grew and settlers pushed westward into territories beyond Penn's original purchases, tensions inevitably increased, demonstrating the limits of even well-intentioned policies in the face of relentless colonial expansion. Delaware's history intertwined with Pennsylvania's, as the region was initially settled by Swedes and Finns in the late 1630s before falling under Dutch and then English control. William Penn acquired the territory to ensure Pennsylvania's access to the Atlantic coast. Delaware functioned under Pennsylvania's governance but maintained its own assembly, and by the early 18th century had achieved practical autonomy while remaining nominally under Pennsylvania's proprietorship until formal separation in 1776. The southern colonies developed yet another distinct pattern characterized by plantation agriculture, greater social stratification, and earlier and more extensive reliance on enslaved African labor. Maryland, established in 1634 as a proprietary colony granted to Cecilius Calvert, Lord Baltimore, was intended partly as a refuge for English Catholics who faced discrimination under Protestant rule. However, Catholics never constituted a majority of Maryland's population, and the colony struggled with recurring religious tensions between Catholic and Protestant factions. The Act Concerning Religion, passed by the Colonial Assembly in 1649, granted religious freedom to all Christians, representing an important though limited step toward tolerance that reflected practical recognition that neither Catholics nor Protestants could dominate permanently. Maryland's economy centered on tobacco cultivation similar to Virginia, creating parallel social structures based on large plantations worked initially by indentured servants and increasingly by enslaved Africans as the 17th century progressed. The Carolinas emerged from a proprietary charter granted in 1663 to 8 lords proprietors loyal to King Charles II. The region attracted diverse settlers, including English colonists from Barbados and other Caribbean islands, who brought with them experience in plantation agriculture and slavery. poor English families seeking land, French Huguenot refugees fleeing religious persecution, and various other groups. The northern and southern portions of Carolina developed differently, with the southern region around Charleston establishing an economy based initially on trade with Native Americans and production of naval stores before discovering rice cultivation in the 1690s. Rice proved extraordinarily profitable, but required intensive labor under dangerous and unhealthy conditions in swampy lowlands. This economic foundation led South Carolina to develop the highest proportion of enslaved Africans relative to European colonists of any mainland colony, creating a society with distinctive characteristics and constant fear of slave rebellion. North Carolina developed more slowly and with different patterns, characterized by smaller farms, greater economic diversity, and a population that included many settlers who had migrated south from Virginia. The region's lack of good harbors limited commercial development compared to South Carolina, but it attracted families seeking land for subsistence farming and modest commercial agriculture. The distinction between North and South Carolina became formalized in 1712 when they were separated into distinct colonies, though both remained under nominal proprietary control until becoming royal colonies in 1729. Georgia, the final colony to be established, emerged from motivations that combined philanthropy, strategic considerations, and social experimentation. James Oglethorpe and other trustees received a charter in 1732 with multiple objectives, including providing a fresh start for England's worthy poor, creating a buffer zone protecting South Carolina from Spanish Florida, and establishing a colony where silk production might flourish. The trustees implemented unusual policies for the era, initially prohibiting slavery, restricting alcohol consumption, limiting land ownership to prevent large plantations, and excluding Catholics. Oglethorpe personally led settlers to establish Savannah in 1733, designing the city with an innovative plan featuring public squares that persists in its modern layout. Georgia's experimental policies proved difficult to maintain against settler resistance and practical challenges. Colonists complained that prohibitions on slavery placed them at economic disadvantage compared to neighboring South Carolina, where enslaved labor enabled profitable rice and indigo cultivation. The restrictions on land ownership frustrated colonists who aspired to establish larger holdings. By the early 1750s, most of the original prohibitions had been abandoned, slavery was permitted, and Georgia began to develop plantation agriculture similar to South Carolina. The colony's population remained small compared to other colonies, and it struggled economically until rice cultivation took hold following the adoption of slavery. Throughout these varied colonial experiences, relationships with Native American peoples profoundly shaped colonial development. The indigenous populations initially encountered by English settlers represented sophisticated societies with complex political organizations, extensive trade networks, advanced agricultural practices, and rich cultural traditions. The Powhatan Confederacy in Virginia, the Wampanoag and other Algonquian-speaking peoples in New England, the Iroquois Confederacy in the interior regions, and numerous other groups possess their own histories, political structures, and territorial interests that English colonization threatened fundamentally. Initial contacts sometimes involved cooperation and exchange, as indigenous peoples and colonists traded goods and knowledge that benefited both parties. However, the fundamental incompatibility between colonial expansion and indigenous sovereignty meant that cooperation gradually gave way to conflict. English colonization patterns differed significantly from Spanish and French approaches in ways that intensified conflicts with indigenous peoples. Spanish colonization, while often brutal, incorporated indigenous populations into colonial society through missions, encomienda labor systems, and intermarriage that created mestizo populations. French colonization, focused heavily on fur trading, required maintaining positive relationships with indigenous trading partners and resulted in more limited territorial encroachment. English colonization, by contrast, centered on acquiring land for agricultural settlement and displacing indigenous populations, creating zero-sum dynamics where colonial success necessitated indigenous dispossession. The escalating tensions erupted, periodically, into devastating conflicts. In Virginia, growing English encroachment onto Powhatan lands led to increasingly frequent violence. In 1622, the Powhatan Confederacy, under the leadership of Opechancanough, following Wahunsenacaw's death, launched coordinated attacks that killed approximately 1/4 of Virginia's colonial population. This attack transformed English attitudes, leading to sustained warfare aimed at destroying indigenous resistance and seizing land. Another major uprising in 1644 resulted in similar patterns of violence and ultimate indigenous defeat as English military advantages in firearms and ability to sustain prolonged campaigns gradually overwhelmed indigenous resistance. In New England, King Philip's War, fought from 1675 to 1676, represented the bloodiest conflict in proportion to population in American history. Metacomet, known to the English as King Philip, led a confederation of indigenous groups in desperate resistance against colonial expansion that threatened to destroy their societies entirely. The war devastated both sides, with approximately 3,000 indigenous people and 600 colonists killed, numerous towns destroyed, and indigenous communities in southern New England largely eliminated through death, enslavement, or forced migration. The colonial victory, though costly, effectively ended significant indigenous resistance in the southern New England region and opened additional lands for colonial settlement. These conflicts demonstrated patterns that would repeat throughout colonial history. Indigenous peoples fighting to preserve their lands and ways of life against colonial expansion, temporary indigenous military successes followed by eventual defeat, due to colonial advantages in population, resources, and military technology, and territorial expansion justified by colonists through ideologies that portrayed indigenous peoples as savage obstacles to civilized development. The demographic catastrophe inflicted on indigenous populations by European diseases against which they had no immunity compounded the military dimensions of colonial expansion. Epidemics of smallpox, measles, influenza, and other diseases swept through indigenous communities with devastating effect, sometimes killing the majority of populations before sustained contact even occurred. These disease impacts dramatically weakened indigenous ability to resist colonial encroachment and created a tragic irony whereby European colonization brought about indigenous dispossession partly through biological factors beyond anyone's control or understanding at the time. As the colonies developed through the 17th and early 18th centuries, they evolved distinctive economic, social, and cultural characteristics while remaining part of the British imperial system. New England developed an economy based on mixed farming, fishing, shipping, and commerce, with Boston emerging as a major port connecting colonial and Atlantic trade networks. The region's rocky soil and shorter growing season prevented large-scale plantation agriculture, resulting in relatively more equitable distribution of property and family-based farming communities. New England also developed significant commercial fishing and whaling industries that connected colonists to broader Atlantic economies. The Middle Colonies evolved as the breadbasket of colonial America, producing wheat and other grains in quantities sufficient for export, while also developing diversified economies including commerce, manufacturing, and iron production. Pennsylvania and New York in particular became economically dynamic regions with growing urban centers and increasingly diverse populations. The religious and ethnic diversity of the Middle Colonies created more pluralistic societies where no single religious denomination dominated completely, fostering pragmatic approaches to religious coexistence born from necessity rather than philosophical commitment to tolerance. The Southern colonies, meanwhile, developed plantation-based economies centered on tobacco, rice, and later indigo cultivation. These labor-intensive crops, combined with the availability of land and the profitability of large-scale production, created powerful incentives for plantation development. The institution of slavery became deeply embedded in Southern colonial society, with enslaved Africans and their descendants providing the labor that sustained plantation economies. By the mid-18th century, Virginia had the largest population of any colony, but South Carolina had the highest proportion of enslaved people, whose labor in rice cultivation generated substantial wealth for plantation owners while enduring conditions of brutal exploitation. The legal framework of slavery evolved gradually across the colonies, with early uncertainty about the status of Africans giving way to increasingly systematic racial codification. Colonial legislatures passed laws that defined slavery as hereditary, permanent, and racial in character, while simultaneously restricting the rights of free black individuals. These slave codes regulated every aspect of enslaved people's lives, prohibited education, severely punished resistance, and created legal structures that treated human beings as property. The development of racial slavery represented a fundamental contradiction within colonial society, as colonists who increasingly articulated principles of liberty and rights simultaneously built economic and social systems based on the most extreme denial of those principles. By the middle decades of the 18th century, the 13 colonies had developed into mature societies with combined populations approaching 2 million people. They maintained political structures that combined British imperial authority with substantial local self-governance. Each colony had a governor, typically appointed by the king or proprietor, who represented royal authority. Colonial assemblies, elected by propertied male colonists, controlled taxation and legislation, giving colonists substantial voice in their own governance. This system created persistent tensions between governors seeking to implement imperial policies and assemblies defending colonial interests and prerogatives. The colonies participated in British imperial wars against French and Spanish rivals. Conflicts known in Europe as the War of Spanish Succession, the War of Austrian Succession, and the 7 Years' War, but called Queen Anne's War, King George's War, and the French and Indian War in the colonies. These conflicts drew colonists into European power struggles while simultaneously heightening colonial awareness of their strategic importance and military contributions to British imperial interests. The French and Indian War particularly affected colonial development as British victory in 1763 eliminated the French threat from North America, but left Britain with enormous war debts and a determination to make colonies contribute more to imperial expenses. Throughout their development, the colonies evolved cultural patterns that combined English traditions with adaptations to American circumstances. Colonial society remained hierarchical, with wealthy merchants, large landowners, and professional classes at the top, middling farmers and artisans forming a substantial middle group, and indentured servants, landless laborers, and enslaved Africans at the bottom. However, the relative availability of land for those who could afford it, compared to Europe's more rigid social structures, created opportunities for upward mobility that, while limited and excluding enslaved people entirely, exceeded what most European societies offered. Religious life in the colonies became increasingly diverse and contested. The Great Awakening of the 1730s and 1740s, a religious revival movement featuring emotional preaching by figures such as Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield, swept through the colonies, creating both religious enthusiasm and controversy. The revival emphasized personal religious experience, questioned established religious authorities, and contributed to growing denominational diversity as new churches formed. This movement had social implications beyond religion, as its challenges to traditional authority and emphasis on individual spiritual experience resonated with emerging political ideas about rights and governance. Colonial intellectual life remained limited compared to European centers of learning, Yet the colonies gradually developed educational institutions, printing presses that produced newspapers and pamphlets, and participation in Enlightenment intellectual currents that emphasized reason, empirical observation, and natural rights philosophy. Figures such as Benjamin Franklin in Philadelphia embodied colonial intellectual ambitions, pursuing scientific experiments, philosophical inquiry, and practical innovations, while building institutions from libraries to fire companies that served public welfare. The 13 colonies that emerged from more than a century and a half of development represented diverse societies with distinct regional characteristics, yet they shared important commonalities. All were products of English colonization operating under British imperial authority. All had developed economies integrated into Atlantic trading networks dominated by Britain. All featured representative institutions that gave propertied colonists significant voice in local governance. All maintained societies stratified by wealth, race, and status, with slavery deeply embedded in colonial social and economic structures. All had participated in imperial wars and frontier conflicts that shaped their development and sense of identity. These colonies were not created according to any unified plan, but emerged from varied motivations including commercial profit-seeking, religious idealism, political strategy, and individual opportunity. Virginia began as a commercial venture that nearly failed before tobacco cultivation provided economic viability. Massachusetts resulted from Puritan religious convictions seeking to build godly communities. Pennsylvania embodied Quaker principles of religious tolerance and peaceful coexistence. Georgia combined philanthropic impulses with imperial strategy. Yet from this diverse array of origins, the colonies had evolved into societies that, despite their differences, shared enough common features and interests to eventually unite in revolution against the imperial system that had spawned them. The path from diverse colonial founding to unified resistance would require circumstances and provocations that emerged in the 1760s and 1770s, but the colonial period itself had established the foundations upon which American independence would be built. The story of how 13 separate colonies were born contains within it the seeds of how they would eventually forge themselves into a single nation, though that outcome remained far from inevitable during the colonial centuries themselves.